All right. Artistic achievements. Unfortunately, the rest of this chapter is more or less so many names. Sorry about that, but that's just kind of how the cookie crumbles when it comes to some of this stuff. But anyway, well, let's get started. Our artistic achievements. Artistic, wonderful. So it starts off by talking about architecture and how architecture was more or less like we were just trying to get the buildings built quickly. We weren't really concerned about establishing a true American architecture. So a lot of our buildings weren't original designs. We used a lot of kind of the Greek and the Roman Gothic styles. Thomas Jefferson, you may say, could be an exception to that rule. His beautiful home at Monticello was a beautiful architectural achievement. Good job, Thomas Jefferson. And also, he did a lot with the University of Virginia and just designing the campus. So he was kind of a highlight of the architecture, but really is rather borrowed, you could say. Painting really didn't flourish at this time. Of course, we didn't have a lot of leisure time as it was, so there wasn't a lot of time or opportunity to really develop those skills. And also, we didn't really have that wealthy aristocratic class that would pay to have their portraits painted or that sort of thing. So we really didn't have the wealthy class that could hire the painters. So that kind of suffered with the poor suffering painters. Okay, also just the Calvinistic, Puritanistic culture that was going on in America at this time really saw kind of the fine arts like theater, painting, like I said, the arts in general as kind of a sinful waste of time. You know, Protestant work ethic, right? You should be getting to work. You shouldn't be wasting time with these hobbies. Some of the paintings or the painters they talked about, Edward Stewart painted some famous portraits of Washington, as did Charles Pearl. He did over 60 of Washington's portraits. How exciting would that be? Ooh. John Thurble is a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He painted some scenes from his memory about the Revolutionary War. So not a whole lot to talk about there, but it existed. Another kind of bright spot for painting was the Hudson River School on the Hudson River. The Hudson River School was awesome. It was just it was a school for painters, but they really thrived or excelled at painting Americans' landscapes. So kind of the local landscapes of America. So that was really kind of cool, the Hudson River School and those lovely landscape paintings. Music in general, the Puritans frowned upon non-religious music, so it didn't get too much of a chance to really grow and to develop. We did see some music forms outside of religion. The minstrel shows, of course, happened. They had, a lot of times they would have white actors painted their faces black and kind of acting as slaves. Probably not the most political correct thing to do today. The minstrel shows were out and about. In the South, we got the music of Dixie was developing. A lot of that, the heart of that were kind of the black spirituals the slaves had. Stephen Foster, although he was not a slave, really did a lot to kind of capture this music of the slaves. So he did write down some of their songs, but also wrote a lot of music kind of in that same plaintive spirit. Plaintive meaning like complaining against their lot in life. So Stephen Foster was really big with developing or writing down a lot of African spirituals. Unfortunately, he became a drunk and died penniless. See, the temperance movement, like they had something there, right? Stephen Foster, example. All right, next section, the blossoming of national literature. So stop talking about the other arts, now we're talking about literature, and I think we're going to pretty much stick with literature for the rest of the chapter. Woo! So novels in America were not a big thing at first. We were more about writing political essays. We had, remember Thomas Paine and Common Sense. Hamilton, Madison wrote the Federalist Papers. Those were very important documents, but not exactly works of fiction or anything too exciting to read. Ben Franklin did write an autobiography that had some distinction, but really there wasn't a lot going on right away, right during the Revolution in literature. After the War of 1812, though, we had this huge surge of nationalism and this boost of nationalism that came after the War of 1812. That's really what kind of boosted or sparked kind of like a true American literature movement. The War of 1812, you just keep coming back to haunt us. Okay, so like by the 1820s, after the War of 1812, we really, are out of survival mode. Before this time, we were just like, we just founded this country. We want to make sure it's like gonna work out, that it sticks together. But now that we're out of kind of like survival mode as a country, that's of course again after the War of 1812, we really get this kind of boost of nationalism and American literature. I can pronounce things. Okay, one of the kind of the first sparks of this American literature was a group out of New York. They're called the Knickerbocker Group. So they were a group of writers, and there's really kind of three big names that are connected with this Knickerbocker group in New York. And that's Washington Irving, and he wrote the Knickerbockers' History of New York. He also wrote the sketchbook, which had within it contained, that's the word, the sketchbook contained the story of Rip Van Winkle, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Both of those are probably ones you've heard of before if you've not read. And he really, Washington Irving, introduced American literature to Europe. So a lot of people in Europe would read literature and kind of get a taste of American culture, I should say, through these books. Good job, Washington Irving. Another Knickerbocker was James Fenimore Cooper, and he's really considered the first American novelist. He wrote The Spy, which is about the American Revolution, The Leather Stocking Tales, The Last of the Mohicans, both of those super famous. Good job, James Fenimore Cooper. Last of our Knickerbockers here is William Cullen Bryant, and he was a poet, kind of wrote the first big American poem, and that was called Thanatos, but also because poets don't really make a lot of money, he had a day job, and he was the editor of the New York Evening Post for a very long time. He also kind of set some precedents when it came to American journalism through his work at the New York Evening Post. Alright, so that is more or less kind of, where am I here? Those were our Knickerbockers. And now we're going to talk about the trumpeters of transcendentalism. Transcendentalism, hey, what is it? Well, let's explain it. So transcendentalism is a literary, meaning like books, a literary and an intellectual movement. It emphasized individualism, self-reliance, had the belief that each person had an inner light that can point the way to truth and direct contact with God. So transcendentalism, it's kind of hard to really, it's kind of mystical, kind of hard to define, but they believe that there is like an inner light in everybody and that all knowledge would come from this inner light. It's not reason, it's not logic, it's not learning through the senses, it's not learning through experimentation or observation. It's all knowledge comes from this kind of inner light. Very mystical, kind of hippie-esque, whatever. Whatever, I don't care. But yeah, because of this, they're very much emphasize the dignity of the individual, black or white. Also very hostile to authority and formal institutions. We kind of have three big writers that are connected with transcendentalism. So kind of like we had the three Knickerbocker group from the Knickerbocker group, and these are kind of three from the transcendental group, transcendentalists. Okay, we've talked about him before, but Ralph Waldo Emerson, he was a big transcendentalist. He was from Boston, and at first he was actually a Unitarian minister. But soon he started to write He made the circuits in the lyceums, so he'd go from town to town, from lyceum to lyceum, and he was a lecturer, so that was very famous. He became famous through that. He gave this really famous speech called The American Scholar, and it was a speech at Harvard where he really kind of urged Americans to kind of, throw off European traditions when it came to writing and really develop an American literary writing. So he really encouraged Americans not just to copy Europeans, but really to develop their own thing. And, of course, because he was a transcendentalist, he was all about self-reliance, self-improvement, optimism, and freedom. Of course, a big, outspoken critic of slavery. So all of our transcendentalists more or less are. Next transcendentalist we'll talk about is Henry David Thoreau. He was a friend of Emerson, and Thoreau spent 2 years living simply, you could say, on the bank of Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. He writes about his 2 years of kind of this seclusion in the essay Walden, or Life in the Woods. A huge thing that Henry David Thoreau wrote was an essay that's called On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. And this inspired Gandhi, this inspired Martin Luther King Jr., all about kind of nonviolent resistance. So On the Duty of Civil Disobedience, that was an idea from Henry David Thoreau, and it really kind of made a big impact in the world, right, because of Gandhi and also because of Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, our last transcendentalist writer of sorts is Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman was a Brooklyn poet, and you could say he was the poet of democracy. He had a love for the masses or the common people, very enthusiastic for America, very emotional, very kind of unconventional poetry. Some of his books were considered to be too racy, so his books were actually banned in Boston for a while. And really, his big work, Leaves of Grass, his big book of poetry, it really wasn't popular in America till after his death. So anyway, 3 transcendentalists, I said again, Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman. Well, why don't we just keep talking about poets? Glorious, because that's what we're going to do. Next section is Growing Literary Lights. So these are all just a bunch of poets that had them around at this time, and we're going to talk about them. Professor Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was perhaps the most famous American poet. He wasn't a transcendentalist, but he wrote, the Song of Hiawatha. He had 2 wives. Both of them had died. One of them died in front of his eyes when her dress caught on fire. That's probably not important, but one of those details, you're like, that's horrific, horrible. Anyway, Longfellow. Okay, next we have John Greenleaf Whittier. He was known as the Fighting Quaker, so he's a Quaker. He's not quite as talented as Longfellow, but his poetry really had a lot of anti-slavery themes to him. So you could kind of say Whittier is kind of the poet of human freedom. James Russell Lowell he taught poetry at Harvard after Longfellow left. So Longfellow had been a professor at Harvard, but now Lowell's kind of taking his place. He was a diplomat, a kind of a critic, a political satirist, that sort of thing. So he was there. He made a splash. He's noteworthy. Wonderful. Next, and we have Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes. Dr. Holmes has actually taught anatomy at Harvard Medical School, but he did write poems. One of his famous poems is called The Last Leaf, which is talking about the Boston Tea Party, and he really was kind of the last among the kind of a group of distinguished contemporaries. So he was kind of like the last one. It's worth noting. But we're not actually done yet. We have to talk about women and their work in writing stuff. So we have Louisa May Alcott. She wrote Little Women. and Little Men, but no one ever reads Little Men, but whatever. She wrote Little Women, and she really wrote more or less to support herself and her mother and her sisters. We had Emily Dickinson, which of course was a poet. She is a poet who really kind of lived as a recluse. For a while there, she would only wear white. She more or less locked herself into her home and wrote poetry all day. And she didn't allow any of her poems to be published till after her death. So it really was then after her death that she became well known. In the South, we kind of have this one guy in the South that's really worth noting. His name is William Gilmore Sims. William Gilmore Sims. He wrote over 82 books, and most of those were talking about kind of the southern frontier, southern colonial life, the South during the Revolutionary War. So this guy, William Sims, was really kind of like the South's spokesperson. Sure. Oh, but we're not done talking about literature. You think, like, no, we don't need to know anymore. Well, apparently you do. Next section, literary individualists and dissenters. So when we're talking about individualists, the big name that comes up is Edgar Allan Poe. He was very much a dark writer, a lot of poetry, a lot of horror stories, some detective fiction. He was orphaned at a young age. Throughout his life, suffered from ill health, married a 13-year-old girl. That's creepy. Anyway, famous poem, of course, one of the poems is The Raven. The Boston Ravens are actually named after the poem. Edgar Allan Poe died in Baltimore drunk on a street, but Baltimore, I guess, they still claim him, so the Baltimore Ravens are named after Poe's poem, The Raven, because he had died in Baltimore. Another short story you've probably read, The Fall of the House of Usher, very morbid, very dark. That's more or less Edgar Allan Poe for you. We have a couple more dissenters, or I shouldn't say dissenters, they're kind of like the Puritan writers, or writers that had like a religious flair to them. We had Nathaniel Hawthorne, and he wrote The Scarlet Letter, which you've probably read. It talks about a Puritan society, and that there's a woman who was caught in adultery, so she had to wear a red A on her clothing, thus the Scarlet or Red Letter. So that was super famous, and yeah, America. Another big American name was Herman Melville, and this is, again, has kind of religious themes. It's an allegory of good and evil. I should say the name. He wrote the book Moby Dick, okay, and it's an allegory about good and evil. It's about this old man whose name is Ahab, and his search for the giant white whale. He's seeking revenge because this giant white whale had bitten his leg off. So it wasn't immediately popular, and he was kind of ignored, but later on it became popular. So Herman Melville, once again, kind of writing almost with religious themes. Okay. And then this last section here is very exciting because this is the history about historians. What? Yes, history about historians. So portraits of the past. Just some more names they talk to us about. George Bancroft is considered the father of American history. He wrote this huge 6-volume history of America. He also helped found the Naval Academy in Annapolis, so kind of a big deal. We have William Prescott, who wrote about the conquest of Mexico and Peru. We have Francis Parkman, and he wrote about kind of the France and Britain in the colonial times when they were trying to fight for North America. And really kind of in general, most historians did come from New England. So a lot of their history kind of has a Northerner's perspective or a Northerner's bias. There wasn't really any really big names when it came to history in the South. So really a lot of this history at the time was kind of biased towards the North, especially New England. So I think I've given you enough names to simmer over for now. And I think we're officially done with culture in the 1840s through the 1860s.